There's a specific kind of silence you only find on the water. It's not the absence of sound. Really, it's more like the world is holding its breath. If you've spent any time in the North Woods, specifically around the Boundary Waters or the deep cedar-stained lakes of northern Ontario, you know exactly what I'm talking about. The water acts like a mirror, not just for the pines and the sky, but for your own thoughts. It's peaceful, right up until the moment it isn't. I grew up on those lakes. My father was a man who believed that if you couldn't reach a place by a two-stroke outboard motor, it wasn't worth visiting. I spent my childhood summers in the back of a battered 1988 Boston Whaler. The smell of premixed gasoline and dried worm bedding permanently etched into my sensory memory. There was a sense of absolute safety in that routine, the rhythmic times, thrum times of the hull hitting the chop, the spray of cold, fresh water on your face, and the knowledge that as long as you had a full tank and a life jacket, you were the king of the world. But the wilderness has a way of reminding you that you're just a guest. And sometimes, it makes it very clear that you've overstayed your welcome. A few years ago, in late August, my childhood friend Elias and I decided to do one last legacy trip. We were both in our late 20s, drifting into the responsibilities of adulthood, and we wanted to recapture that feeling of being untethered. We chose a massive, sprawling lake system near the border, a place known for its labyrinthine channels and islands, so numerous they didn't all have names. The first 2 days were perfect. It was that classic, nostalgic setup. We'd spend the mornings casting for smallmouth bass, the afternoons swimming in water so clear you could see 30 feet down to the jagged rock ribs of the earth, and the evenings sitting by a crackling fire. We were drinking cheap beer, laughing about the girls we'd struck out with in high school, and feeling that deep, soul-level relaxation that only comes when your phone hasn't had a signal for 48 hours. On the third day, we decided to push further north than we ever had. We wanted to find the Tooth, a legendary rock formation Elias's uncle had told him about an island that supposedly looked like a canine tooth jutting out of the water, surrounded by the deepest part of the lake. We set out at dawn. The lake was glass calm, a perfect silver sheet. The only thing breaking the surface was our wake, peeling away from the whaler in two long, beautiful curls. As the sun climbed, the heat began to shimmer off the surface, creating that strange watery haze where the horizon disappears and the sky and lake become one shimmering blue void. It took us nearly 4 hours to find it. The Tooth wasn't exactly where the old hand-drawn map said it would be, but when we saw it, there was no mistaking it. It was a jagged vertical monolith of granite, maybe an acre in total size, crowned with a dense, unnatural-looking cluster of stunted black spruce. "Looks cozy," Elias joked, but I noticed he wasn't smiling. There was something off about the island. Most islands in this chain are surrounded by shallows, sandy bars, or rock flats where you can see the bottom. But the water surrounding the Tooth was black. Not deep blue, but a flat, ink-like black that seemed to swallow the light. We cut the engine about 50 yards out and let the momentum carry us in. The silence hit us then. It was heavy. Usually, in August, the woods are a riot of noise, cicadas buzzing, chickadees flitting, the occasional splash of a northern pike. Here, there was nothing. No birds, no bugs, just the faint times, slap times of the water against our hull. "Do you smell that?" I asked, wiping sweat from my forehead. Elias sniffed the air. "Smells like wet copper and old wood." It was a metallic, sickly sweet scent. We brushed it off as stagnant water trapped in the rock pools, but the feeling of unease was already beginning to coil in my gut. Against my better judgment, we decided to dock. The usual campsites on the main shoreline had been crowded, and the idea of having this strange, lonely island to ourselves was too tempting for two guys looking for adventure. We found a flat shelf of rock on the eastern side and hauled the whaler up, tying it off to a thick, gnarled root. As we began unloading our gear, the tent, the cooler, the dry bags, the feeling of being watched became impossible to ignore. You know that prickle on the back of your neck? The one that tells you a predator is tracking you? It was constant. I kept looking back over my shoulder at the dense stand of spruce, expecting to see a bear or maybe a rogue moose, but the trees were so thick, so tightly packed, that you couldn't see more than 3 feet into the shadows. The The first off detail happened while we were setting up the tent. Elias was hammering in a stake when he stopped and pointed toward the water. "Hey, did we leave a buoy out there?" I looked. About 30 yards out, right where the black water met the lighter blue of the channel, something was bobbing. It was small, dark, and perfectly still. At first, I thought it was a loon, but it didn't have the right profile. It looked like a carved piece of wood, a mask, or a head, just the top half of it floating above the surface. We watched it for a full minute. It didn't move with the current. It stayed perfectly stationary, as if it were anchored to the bottom. "Probably just a deadhead," I said, referring to a submerged log. "The current must be weird here." But there was no current. The lake was dead calm. We finished the camp and tried to settle in. We built a small fire more for the comfort of the light than for warmth. As the sun began to dip below the tree line, the atmosphere on the tooth shifted from eerie to oppressive. The shadows didn't just grow longer, they seemed to get thicker, like they had physical weight. That's when I found the circle. I had wandered a few yards away from the fire to gather some more kindling near the edge of the spruce thicket. My flashlight beam cut through the gloom, hitting something white. I moved closer, thinking it was a bleached log. It wasn't a log. Underneath the low-hanging branches of a spruce, someone had arranged a perfect circle of stones. But these weren't just any stones. They were smooth, white river pebbles, the kind you only find at the bottom of fast-moving streams, of which there were none on this island. And in the center of the circle, tucked into the moss, were objects. A rusted fishhook, a lock of hair tied with a piece of frayed twine, and a small, hand-carved wooden figure that looked disturbingly like a man sitting in a boat. The figure had no eyes, just deep, gouged-out holes. I felt a jolt of genuine fear. This wasn't cool or mysterious. It felt deliberate. It felt like an offering, or a warning. "Elias," I called out, my voice sounding thin and brittle in the heavy air. "We need to look at something." He walked over, his own flashlight bobbing. When he saw the circle, he didn't say anything for a long time. He just stared at the eyeless wooden man. Maybe someone was just playing around. He finally said, though the tremor in his voice betrayed him, "You know, kids, scout troops come through here all the time. Elias, we're 3 hours from the nearest trailhead. This isn't a scout project." We decided right then that we wouldn't stay the night. The bravado was gone. The nostalgia was gone. We were two grown men suddenly terrified of a pile of rocks and a piece of wood. We started throwing our gear back into the dry bags, moving with a frantic, clumsy energy. But the lake had other plans. As we reached the rock shelf where we tied the boat, we both froze. The whaler was still there, bobbing gently against the granite, but the engine, the reliable 15-horse Mercury that had never failed me, was tilted up. And the fuel line had been cleanly, surgically severed. The smell of gasoline hit us then, mixing with that metallic, coppery scent. The fuel hadn't just leaked, it had been drained. The red plastic tank sat in the middle of the boat, its cap missing, completely empty. I looked out at the water, my heart hammering against my ribs. The dark object we'd seen earlier, the deadhead, was gone. In its place, about 10 yards closer to the shore, was a ripple, a slow, deliberate V-shape in the water, heading straight toward our dock. "Get the light on it," Elias hissed. I swung my high-powered tactical light toward the ripple. The beam cut through the dark, illuminating the black water. For a split second, I saw it. It wasn't a log. It wasn't an animal. It was a face, or at least, the suggestion of one. It was pale, bloated, and slick, with features that seemed to have been worn smooth by the water, like a piece of driftwood. It had no hair, no ears, and where the eyes should have been, there were only two dark, empty pits, exactly like the wooden carving in the woods. It didn't submerge. It didn't swim. It just drifted, its head barely breaking the surface, staring at us with those hollow voids. "Go! Get in the boat!" I yelled. We didn't have the engine, but we had oars. We scrambled into the whaler, the boat rocking violently under our weight. Elias grabbed the oars and began to row with a desperate, panicked strength, while I stood in the stern, My flashlight fixed on the spot where we'd seen the thing. The beam hit the water, but the face was gone. "Is it following us?" Elias gasped, his breath coming in ragged lunges. "I don't know. Just keep rowing." We were maybe 50 yards off the island when the sound started. It wasn't a scream, and it wasn't a roar. It was a low, vibrating hum that seemed to come from the water itself. It was so deep I could feel it in my teeth, a frequency that signaled pure, primal wrongness. And then, from the direction of the island, we heard the splash. A heavy, wet sound, like something very large and very soft sliding off the rocks and into the black water. Elias didn't look back. He couldn't. His entire world had shrunk to the rhythmic, agonizing pull of the oars against the resisting weight of the lake. Every muscle in his back was corded, straining against the wood, and I could hear the wet, desperate rasp of his breath over the sound of the water, but I couldn't look away. I stood there, clutching the gunwale of that tiny rowboat, my flashlight trembling in a hand that didn't feel like mine. The beam of light was a pathetic, flickering thing against the vast, oppressive curtain of the night. It cut a weak path through the mist, illuminating nothing but the churning wake we were leaving behind. And then I saw it. It wasn't a face anymore. Not exactly. It was a disturbance in the water, a V-shaped ripple that was cutting through the surface with a terrifying silent efficiency. Whatever had slid off those rocks wasn't just drifting, it was navigating, it was pursuing. "Elias, faster," I whispered, though my voice cracked, barely audible over the hum that was still vibrating through the floorboards. The hum. It's hard to describe if you haven't felt it. It wasn't a sound you heard with your ears, so much as a sensation you felt in your marrow. It felt like the water itself was screaming at a frequency too low for the human mind to process, a physical pressure that made my nose begin to bleed. I wiped the warmth from my upper lip, staring at the dark stain on my sleeve, and that's when the smell hit us. It wasn't just the smell of the lake. It was the scent of something ancient and anaerobic, like a tomb that had been submerged for 1,000 years and suddenly cracked open. It was the smell of wet fur, stagnant silt, and something sweet, sickly sweet, like lilies left to rot in a closed room. "I see it," I yelled, finally finding my voice as a pale, slick shape broke the surface 30 feet behind us. It looked like the curve of a massive, hairless back, gray-white and glistening like the belly of a dead fish. It didn't splash. It just rose and fell, a silent undulation that was closing the gap between us with every stroke of Elias's oars. "Get the motor," Elias screamed, his voice breaking into a sob. "The outboard, get it started." I lunged for the small 3-horsepower motor at the stern. My hands were slick with sweat and lake spray, fumbling blindly for the pull cord. I gave it a yank. Nothing, just a hollow, metallic cough that seemed to mock us. I pulled again and again. Behind us, the ripple was 20 feet away, then 15. The hum intensified, reaching a crescendo that made my vision blur. The water around the rowboat began to bubble, tiny effervescent pops that released more of that cloying graveyard stench. I looked down into the water right beside the boat, and for a split second, the flashlight beam penetrated the depths. I didn't see a monster. I saw a hand, but it was too long. The fingers were spindly, multi-jointed things that ended in soft, bulbous pads, reaching up through the dark green water toward the underside of our boat. It wasn't trying to flip us, it was reaching for us. On the fourth pull, the motor sputtered to life. The smell of blue gasoline smoke filled the air, the most beautiful thing I'd ever smelled. I slammed it into gear, and the rowboat lurched forward, the bow lifting as we began to put distance between ourselves and that thing. We didn't stop until we reached the Times Lady May, our main cruiser anchored nearly a mile away. We scrambled up the swim platform, leaving the rowboat tethered and bobbing violently in our wake. We didn't talk, we didn't even look at each other. Elias immediately went to the helm and fired up the twin diesels, while I hauled in the anchor line with a manic, frantic energy. As the Times Lady May times turned and began to head toward the distant lights of the mainland marina, I finally gathered the courage to look back one last time. The island was a jagged silhouette against the starlight, a black tooth rising out of the water. But it wasn't empty. Standing on the very edge of the rocks where we had first seen the movement, there were figures. Not one, but three. They were tall, impossibly thin and bone white. They didn't wave. They didn't move. They just stood there watching us leave, their long arms hanging down past their knees. And then, as if on cue, they stepped back into the trees and vanished. The rest of the night is a blur of adrenaline and cold sweat. We reached the marina by 3 a.m., tied up the boat, and sat in the cabin with every single light turned on until the sun came up. We didn't tell the dockmaster. We didn't call the police. What would we have said? That we were chased by something that hummed? That we saw a hand that didn't belong to a human? In the weeks that followed, Elias and I drifted apart. The shared trauma didn't bond us. It acted like a wedge. Every time we looked at each other, we saw the reflection of that night in the other's eyes. He sold his share of the boat a month later. Last I heard, he moved to Arizona. Somewhere landlocked. Somewhere dry. I still go out on the water sometimes, but never at night, and never ever near that chain of islands. But here's the thing that keeps me awake, the detail I haven't even told Elias. A few days after we got back, I went down to the rowboat to clean it out. I found something snagged on the rough wood of the gunnel, right where I had seen that hand reaching up. It was a small piece of fabric, a scrap of a red flannel shirt. The same red flannel shirt that my uncle used to wear when he went fishing on this lake 20 years ago. The uncle who went missing in these waters and was never found. I try to tell myself it was a coincidence, that the lake is full of debris, and that my mind was just looking for a connection to make sense of the senseless. But then I remember the hum. And I remember the way those figures stood on the shore, almost as if they were waiting for someone to come home. I look at the water now, even from the safety of the pier, and I don't see a place of recreation. I see a veil, a vast, shimmering surface that hides things we aren't meant to understand, things that have been down there for a long time, evolving, adapting, and waiting. Am I overthinking this? Was it just some strange trick of the light and a bit of localized methane gas causing the hum and the bubbles? Or did we stumble onto something that should have remained undisturbed? Whatever it was, I know one thing for certain. The water doesn't just take people. Sometimes, it changes them. And sometimes, it lets you see what they've become just before it pulls you down to join them. What do you think? If you were in that boat, would you have looked back? Or would you have kept your eyes on the horizon and never looked at the water again?